Good morning. Thank you for joining Forensic Analytical Consulting Services today for our webinar, Employer Wildfire Smoke Preparedness, New OSHA Wildfire Emergency Regulation. Today's webinar will be hosted by Forensic Analytical's very own Michelle Rosales and Madeleine Rebullida. Michelle is a certified industrial hygienist and senior project manager out of our Los Angeles area office. She is the leading expert in FACTS's Wildfire and Wildfire Smoke Practice Group and has been working in the environmental health and industrial hygiene field for over 12 years. Michelle is a primary author of AIHA's Technical Guide for Wildfire Impact Assessments for the OEHS Professional Technical Guide and has been asked to present at various associations regarding the topic. Madeleine Rebullida is also a project manager for FACTS out of our Bay Area office and is also a leader in the FACTS Wildfire and Wildfire Smoke Practice Group. Madeleine has worked on many wildfire smoke assessments and is partnering with a variety of clients to train their staff and implement wildfire preparedness plans. And before I hand over the presentation to Michelle, I want to quickly cover how the GoToWebinar platform works. Everyone will be in listen-only mode in order to avoid any background noise, but that does not mean you cannot communicate with us. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you're going to simply enter your question in the questions/text box that you see in the control panel. Michelle, if you advance one slide, we'll show you how that works. We'll go through all of the questions at the end of the presentation as well. So please just enter these as questions come up throughout the presentation. And with that, I'll now pass the presentation over to Michelle.
Thank you, Taylor. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar on wildfire preparedness. It's really great to see so many people interested in this topic because probably about a decade ago, we probably wouldn't have generated as many attendees as we have today. And I attribute that to the evolution of the modern wildfire. We're no longer dealing with what we used to deal with in terms of wildfires. I'm from Southern California, as Taylor stated, and I've seen my share of wildfires both professionally and personally. And the last 2 years have been game changers. We're no longer dealing with a wildfire that's far, far away in a isolated forest, but instead ones that last for weeks on end, destroy entire communities, impact those neighboring cities miles and miles away. So what I hope we gain and you gain from this webinar today is a basic understanding on the principles of the new OSHA emergency standard for you to learn some fundamentals on creating a useful wildfire preparedness and recovery response plan, and also to walk away with some techniques to protect yourself and also your fellow coworkers. And I think it's also important to note that this isn't something we need to think about in the future. It's happening now, and wildfires generally occur without warning. So it's something that you should probably be following this webinar, going back to your company and your employees and discussing in ways to protect your workers. So before we get started on the wildfire preparedness portion of the webinar, I thought I'd go over some important numbers and facts regarding the last 2 years of wildfires and why we are in need of these worker safety protection and regulations. 2018 in California was the deadliest and most destructive wildfire season on record. As a lot of you know, if you're from California, we had a total of 8,527 fires. It burned almost 2 million acres. We had the infamous Camp Fire that occurred in Paradise and destroyed an entire community. Here in Southern California, we had the Woolsey Fire that devastated the Malibu and Ventura areas. And there was also several fatalities, 97 of them being civilians and 6 being firefighters. And for those of you that are not in California, in 2019 season that's occurring right now, and I actually had created all these stats about a week ago, so I'm guessing they probably have gone up a lot, being fire season is occurring right now. But over 6,000 incidents have already occurred, almost 200,000 acres burned, and over 700 structures, and already 3 fatalities. So this is definitely something that is occurring and happening and needs to be addressed. And as this eye chart shows, as you look and see, as the years go by, the number of wildfires seem to be increasing, and I don't expect it to be going down anytime soon with the type of weather, drought, and issues we have going on, particularly on the West Coast. And with discussing wildfire smoke can be composed of a mixture of solids, such as char and ash, also liquids and gases, volatile organic compounds, a whole list of fancy chemical compounds. However, when talking about public health during wildfire events, what we're typically looking at and worried about is the airborne particulate matter that's in the air and being generated during these wildfire events, specifically PM 2.5 and PM 10. And the PM particulate matter 2.5 is defined as a particulate matter that has an aerodynamic diameter of less than 2.5. And for PM10, that would be a diameter of less than 10. And in the case of wildfires, this can be solid particulate or liquid droplets that are suspended in the air, and individuals are being exposed to that during a wildfire event. And why this is an issue is it can irritate your eyes, cause respiratory issues, and also worsen chronic heart and lung diseases, particularly in sensitive populations like children and the older and immune-compromised individuals. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the current Cal OSHA regulations and worker safety guidelines that are available here in California. And although, again, we're talking about California, I have a feeling that for all those other states that have similar wildfire concerns and issues, California regulations and safety guidelines will probably be adopted by other states as well. So although if you're listening to this presentation and thinking just Cal OSHA, I don't necessarily think that you should be thinking that way, because again, I feel like this may be adopted to other states with similar issues that California has. So we have the Cal OSHA emergency standard listed as the top one here, but along with the regulation, there are also worker safety guidelines that Cal OSHA has published and put out and is available for the public and employers to review. And I'm going to go into detail about all four of these. So we have the regulation up here at the top, then also some guidelines on protecting indoor workers from wildfire smoke, worker safety and health during fire cleanup, and then also safety and health of workers rebuilding after wildfires. So let's begin with the emergency regulation, which just came into play in mid to late July of this year. Prior to this, we really didn't have much out there available for worker protection and worker safety. It was kind of left to the employer or to decide what someone could be exposed to in terms of wildfire smoke. And typically, from my experience as a consultant, a lot of people looked at the particulates not otherwise regulated as a standard, which a lot of, if we have other industrial hygienists on the call here, does not seem very reasonable. So who does this regulation apply to? It's for people and companies when the current air quality index for PM 2.5 is 151 or greater, regardless of all the other AQI values for other pollutants. And it also applies for those when the employers should reasonably anticipate that employees may be exposed to wildfire smoke. So what are these AQI values? If you are familiar with air quality management districts and AQI values, typically daily they monitor for PM10, PM 2.5, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide. And while measuring these levels, they come up with an AQI value as listed on the left-hand side here, telling you whether or not your air quality in your area is good, moderate, unhealthy for sensitive populations, unhealthy, very unhealthy, and hazardous. So when talking about the wildfire standard, we're looking at PM 2.5. So if ozone one day is in the unhealthy for sensitive groups or the unhealthy range, that doesn't necessarily mean you will be implementing this emergency regulation. We're just looking at the PM 2.5 and when you hit this unhealthy level of 151 or greater. Who is exempt from this? When they first put out the regulation, there was a misconception that it was just for outdoor workers. But as you read the regulation, it's not specific to outdoor workers. It could be, you could talk about indoor workers, but those exempt are those that are indoor workers or in enclosed structures or vehicles in which there is a filtration system that's occurring. So an enclosed structure with mechanical ventilation system, if you're talking about maybe a truck driver or a person who drives a car regularly, if they have a cabin that it has an air filtration system working, and the employer ensuring that the doors and windows are being closed to reduce the amount of outdoor air that's unfiltered being introduced to the building, you are now exempt from this standard. And also those who can, the employers who can demonstrate that the concentration of the PM 2.5 does not meet or exceed that concentration of an AQI value of 151. And I'll go into more detail about this later in the presentation. However, again, you can refer to AQI values that are available, or you can do your own monitoring to show that your specific area, you do not have that AQI value of 151 or greater. And also exempt are employees who are exposed to this AQI value of 151 or greater for less than 1 hour during a shift, and also firefighters, because they have their own specific standards that they are following. So where can we obtain this data? The regulation spells out specifically various websites that are available, so you don't necessarily need to go out and monitor these PM 2.5 concentrations, but can look to reputable websites that can provide this data for you. So one that I typically use is the US EPA Air Now, which is available on AQMD websites. You can also use the Forest Service Wildland Air Quality Response Program, CARB, which is the California Air Resource Board, or if you're in a different area, you can look to local air pollution control districts, local air quality management districts to obtain this data to identify whether or not your air quality has an AQI value of 151 or greater. And you don't necessarily need to look at websites. You can also get direct contact from these specific management districts and air quality companies that can provide this data to you through telephone, email, or other effective methods to obtain it. If you feel that your AQI value may not necessarily reflect what is presented on those websites, you can do monitoring for your own particulate matter at your work site. And I actually highly recommend this. I do like Air Quality Index, and they give a good amount of information. However, it is important to know that these are forecast values, and the number of monitors you think are out there are generally not. One great example is I had a project in Malibu, and we would refer to Air Quality Index for a while. However, I found out the closest monitor was about 20 miles away in Thousand Oaks. And with forecasting through the Air Quality Management District, they come up with a value. However, again, it doesn't necessarily reflect what was occurring in that specific area. So particularly when you're working at a site and during these wildfire events, winds change so rapidly, I recommend the use of actual monitors to help assist you in evaluating whether or not air quality is okay and what the level is for your specific work area. So it's also important to note that the AQI value is not a concentration. It is a calculation that is used to come up with the value. So when you're looking at the PM 2.5 here on your left-hand side, this is an actual concentration that's measured through a monitor. So if you're looking at an AQI value of 151, the unhealthy range, which puts the emergency regulation into place, that actual concentration would not be 151 micrograms per cubic meter, but instead would represent 55.5 micrograms per cubic meter. So it's important to know this information. If you do plan on using your own monitor, you need to make sure the monitoring you are using is in accordance with what the regulation spells out in Appendix A of the regulation, and also understanding how this particulate monitor works and what the true value stations reflect the actual AQI value. So it's important, if you do plan on doing this, to be well familiar with it or hire a industrial hygienist or any other company to come assist you in evaluating your work area. And not only do you need to monitor and identify when the value gets to this level, but once that occurs, now a lot of other things come into place in terms of the regulations. So now you need to have a hazard communication in place. You have to make sure that your employer is taking measures to protect workers during this AQI value of 151. They need to implement a system for communicating wildfire smoke hazards, talking to individuals, letting them know what are the potential hazards associated with inhaling these wildfire smoke. Also encouraging employees to inform you when wildfire smoke hazards are present without fear of reprisal. It also includes now training of employees. So the employee needs to be trained on, again, the hazards of the actual wildfire, and also ways to protect themselves and everything that goes with the standard, understanding respiratory protection that's necessary. When the AQI value gets greater than 151, the employer needs to recommend and provide respiratory protection for the individuals out there. They can use a N95, they can use full face respirators, half face respirators, but at a minimum, the N95 mask. They also need to implement the use of controls, because again, a lot of people are going straight to the respirators, generally going straight to the respirators and asking questions about that. However, we know with the hierarchy of controls that should be the last means of protection, and that we should think of other ways to implement the use of controls, such as engineering outside that may not necessarily be available. However, maybe restricting work, limiting the amount of work being performed outside, other administrative controls that can be used to reduce worker exposures. And also letting individuals know that they have the right for medical attention if they feel the need during the wildfire event. And again, engineering controls, administrative, respiratory protection. And it's also important to know that if the AQI value gets greater than 500, that it is required that they do wear this respirator. So this is all important information because, again, we know when wildfire events occur, N95s go real quick and are gone out of all the facilities. So understanding the standard and having a surplus of this type of equipment available, and understanding what you need to do in order to follow the regulations is very important, and not waiting for that wildfire event to occur, but being prepared for it in advance. And along with the regulations that I stated, OSHA has available guidelines on protecting workers inside of buildings during wildfire events. Because although we like to think they may be protected, depending on how tight and closed off your building is, there is potential exposure inside the building. So typically with the ventilation system, you may reduce or close outdoor air intake to prevent outdoor air from entering into the space, restricting exits and entries, so you're reducing the amount of unfiltered air to be introduced into the workplace, and then maybe adding air scrubbers or filtration devices, portable ones, into the space to continually filter the air. And OSHA also has a worker safety and health cleanup. This is the guidelines that are currently available are minimal. They generally just talk about safety issues with electrical safety and structural and the health issues, carbon monoxide and smoke-related particulates. However, I'm hoping, and I hope that this will be evolving fairly soon. I recently saw a NIOSH document that went out stating that they did some monitoring and some sampling during the cleanup efforts at the car fire that was up north, and they found workers being exposed to levels of crystalline silica above the action level, metals and polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons on people's hands and on surfaces of equipment. So I see this evolving as well, based on, again, the current wildfire is no longer just wood burning in a forest, but instead now we're dealing with structures burning in entire communities. So worker safety and health cleanup will need to evolve and to protect these workers who are dealing with these cleanup issues. And the last worker safety guidelines available are the rebuilding of properties and structures after a wildfire event. And the guidelines pretty much go over just construction hazards and issues. So it's very limited and kind of refers to a lot of more construction standards and not necessarily specific to wildfires. But they do have some guidance documents available for that. And now I will pass this over to Madeleine, who will go over the Wildfire Preparedness, Response, and Recovery Plan.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm just going to try and figure out how to do this here. Okay. All right. So a lot of what Michelle talked about was detailing what's inside that regulation. A big part of that is having a plan. So within that plan, the plan is completely designed to just minimize the impact of wildfire smoke and wildfire events on employees and employers. So there's three parts to it: preparedness, response, and recovery. And I'm going to go over each one of those in detail. Within preparedness, obviously, there's the written plan. Very critically, you need to establish a chain of command, and not just the standard chain of command within your organization, but you need to delegate someone to be in charge of a team of people that are going to help organize and administer and make decisions throughout the wildfire event. So the individual in charge should be someone who has strong administrative and organizational skills, but also someone who has the authority to delegate and direct different activities. It would be also important to have someone from facilities and maintenance, and definitely important to have someone who at least has a strong working knowledge of the HVAC system within the buildings or any impacted structures. Training is a big part of preparedness as well. Information is power, and Michelle talked a little bit about the respirators, and I think all of us can empathize with having had to confront this issue several times. For those of us in the IH community, we have a lot of knowledge about the use of different types of respirators and when you need them and when you don't, and what's important and what's not. But for your average person, they're seeing smoke in the air, they're smelling smoke, they're potentially feeling some of the effects of breathing that in, and they want to wear a respirator. So providing the training and knowledge and understanding of what's going on around you, how your organization is going to handle it, is going to alleviate a lot of the anxiety and frustration that can come with some of these events. HVAC maintenance is important. You definitely want to look at your PM schedules and make sure everything's up to date. And along with that, making sure that you have any necessary supplies and equipment inventory, making sure you have enough air filters, making sure that you have some of the necessary parts of all those different air handling units and ventilation machines within your buildings and structures, but also any supplies or inventory you might want specific to a wildfire event, such as sticky mats, respirators. Michelle said that they tend to disappear pretty quickly, so making sure you have a lot of those on hand, getting an accurate inventory of that, and then also providing contact information, not just for the individuals within the chain of command, but also for the different suppliers and if you have a third-party company that maintains some of your ventilation equipment on site, you definitely want to have that information in one central location. So along with the preparedness, that also includes an evacuation plan. This may already be included in your IIPP, the existing injury, illness, and prevention plan that you have. at your organization, but you want to make sure that that's been made clear. Landscaping, we'll talk a little bit more in detail on that on some other slides. The SDS, your safety data sheets, your chemical inventory, that should all be detailed in your IAPP as well, but you want to make sure that those are up to date. And then human resources should definitely be involved, especially if you're going to be talking about providing medical attention, or if there's people who are not going to be able to come into work because of issues, you know, that maybe the air is better in their home than it would be, you know, going out to a job site. So another part of the human resources component of the preparedness is, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, but these wildfire events, as Michelle said, often happen without warning, almost exclusively out of nowhere. And now included in these is power shutoffs. So you're dealing with employers who are distraught about the air quality. Potentially they have personally experienced some loss due to the wildfire. They may have family members that are experiencing losses. Perhaps they have, they're a more susceptible group that's sensitive to the air quality. It just causes a fair amount of anxiety. And if you're able to present people with adequate information and support, it allows them to feel like they're a little bit more in control of things. And, you know, a wildfire is a force of nature. No one is in control of it. So it's important to try and establish some, a little bit of security there. So this is the landscaping portion that I was talking about earlier. This is from a website called Firewise.org from NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association. This is an amazing resource. I love this website. They have so many great graphics. They have a ton of different types of information. That was Michelle's screen. Don't blame me for that. They have a ton of information that you can download, like these great informative little PDFs. They also have brochures that you can order. And it's not just about wildfires. It's about all different types of fire events, structure fires, chemical fires, refinery fires, lots of great information. It is a little bit more directed to individual homeowners, but there's portions in there for businesses and for employers. So what this graphic is showing is the what they call the ignition zone. And the ignition zone is this diameter right around sort of the immediate area of the building. And this is a picture of someone's home, obviously, but we can assume that this is the same thing for an office building or a job site. So they detail for you different ways that they recommend spacing out trees and different landscaping features. This here is, again, this is a home, but this has a couple different structures with different intentions on them. One thing, it's not pictured in this graphic, but I was able to hear someone present this information recently, and what he was saying is that mulch next to a building is particularly problematic. And I hadn't thought much about it, but an ember storm occurs during a wildfire. There's a lot of organic material burning in the wildfire. It creates these little sparks of embers that it looks like a storm. They travel on the wind, they can travel long distances. And if those were to hit the side of a building, even if it was wood siding, they're just going to hit it and they're going to fall to the ground. They're not hot enough to ignite that material just by touching it. However, if they fall to the ground and what's on the ground is a dry combustible material such as mulch or pine needles, that can then cause that structure to ignite. So these are just things to think about, and this is a resource for you to use when you're looking at your landscaping at your site. So moving from the preparedness portion to the response portion during the fire, this is a repeat of information that Michelle shared earlier. These are the things that we are concerned about during the fire. We're concerned about particulate matter, particularly that of PM 2.5 and PM 10, the irritation and physical effects that can happen from smoke, particularly in populations that have some cardiorespiratory diseases. Those will definitely be irritated by smoke and the particulate and chemicals that are in the smoke. And to that end, some of those chemicals in the smoke can be carcinogenic. So Michelle also talked about the EPA site, airnow.gov. This is a screenshot of what the site looks like. I apologize, it's a little blurry, but it gives you quite a bit of information. They're looking at different parameters, different pollutants in the air, not just particulate matter, but also nitrogen dioxide, ozone, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide. And like she said, just, you know, user beware, understand that you shouldn't rely solely on this information. There's a lot of great air quality information out there that is available to people. So I would look at including this as a good starting point. And as part of your response, as we stated, you want to have some emergency response action, some sort of emergency plan, detailed communication, very critical, evacuation plan, any HVAC modifications, and I'll talk about that in detail on a couple other slides, as well as reducing locations of entry. These are a couple different control measures that you can implement, and then making sure that you have the necessary supplies and equipment to respond to the wildfire event. So controlling the air entering the building, you want to consider, you know, potentially closing off the fresh air to the air handling units. This is going to cause your building to feel stuffy. You're going to have an increased amount of carbon dioxide in the building, but that stuffiness is a discomfort that's preferable to the physical health effects of the smoke and particulate. You could also consider replacing higher efficiency filters in your air handlers. You just want to make sure that you consult with the manufacturer's guidelines, because not all air handlers are designed to take a MERV 16, a MERV 14, a MERV higher rated filter. So this is the portion about restricting some of the different points of entry. Keeping doors and windows closed, limiting access to doors. You don't want to create an additional hazard by preventing emergency exits from being utilized. So you can consider putting staff at doors, or depending on how your doors lock or are utilized, just making sure that there's clear communication that those doors are for exit only. Sticky mats are great. If you think about people are coming from a wildfire area into work, or just walking through the parking lot, they're picking up ash and different particulate onto different materials onto their shoes. The sticky mats are a great way to keep that from entering into the building. HEPA air filtration devices, these are definitely useful. I have another slide where we'll talk about those in a little more detail. And then continual cleaning efforts, and we can talk about different ways to clean. So this picture on the right here is a HEPA air filtration unit. The air is entering through the portion on the left, through those little white boxes. There's a pre-filter there, and then a HEPA filter inside of the machine, and it's exhausting through this box on the top, which has been fitted with carbon filters. And carbon filters are useful for controlling some of the odors associated with smoke. So when you're looking at your cleaning efforts, it's nothing more high-tech than just damp wiping things down. You know, when you see dust, just wipe it up. You want to use HEPA vacuums if you are going to be vacuuming. If you're vacuuming up dust and particulate with just a standard vacuum, you're essentially just exhausting that dust and redistributing whatever was in that dust throughout the building. So definitely use a HEPA vacuum for that. The air handling units are very useful. You can rent those. You probably have had some experience with that, but you want to make sure that if you are utilizing them, you're implementing them in a strategic way, that you're placing them in entryways or in the elevator lobbies at each floor. So the entryways is kind of an obvious thing, right? The air is moving in and out through the building at that entryway. And even if those entryways are not being utilized that often, the building is still pressurized in a way that it may be pulling air in from the outside. Elevators will move air throughout a building up and down. So as the elevator moves from the bottom floor to the top floor, they're moving air up through that elevator shaft. So having the air handlers in that elevator lobby is definitely a good idea. So now our wildfire event has reached a terminating point, and we are in recovery mode. Obviously, you've been doing some continual cleanup throughout the process, or maybe you haven't even had access to your facility. So when you re-enter the facility, you want to do a good cleaning. There are companies that will come in and do some detailed cleaning for you if you're not able to, or you don't have the staff to utilize that on your own. Regroup, make a determination about, okay, we think this is we've adequately cleaned here, and then you can conduct a post-cleaning assessment. That's where a hygienist would come in, and we'll talk in detail about these three things: sensory observations, air sampling, and surface sampling. And once you conduct that post-cleaning assessment, you make the determination, or the hygienist makes the determination on your behalf, that the building and the different structures and the components within the building are no longer being impacted in a substantial or significant way by the wildfire smoke. You can go ahead and begin services again. And no, it seems really low tech, but the sensory investigation is the best tool that we have when we are conducting any kind of assessment. If you see smoke related particulate, it's there, obviously. But we're also looking for things like staining and ghosting. Ghosting is when smoke is entering into a space that is been pressurized, it's pulling that smoke in, and you'll see sort of these ghost wispy, what looks like smoke on whatever the wall material is, or some cabinetry. Obviously smoke staining, you can picture what that looks like. And then corrosion. Some of those different chemicals that Michelle was talking about can be corrosive to different materials, the chemicals that are in the particulate matter. So we'll look for the signs of that as well in the exterior of the building, looking at entryways. Olfactory investigation, if you smell the smoke, for sure, you know that it's been impacted by smoke there. And a lot of times, long after cleaning, that odor can still be very irritating. So it's helpful to get a good, thorough investigation of that at the start of the process. If you look at this picture on the right, that's sort of the beginnings of the Ember Storm. You can see some of those sparks in the air and these firefighters working to try and control this wildfire. Smoke-related particulates are generally what we use to evaluate wildfire smoke impact. So we visually assess whether they're there or not. It is the indicator most likely to be present and to remain if undisturbed on surfaces. It's very easy to collect a sample of smoke-related particulates and to analyze it. I don't know if maybe the lab would agree that it's a particularly simple analysis, but it's a fairly easy sample collection and analysis process. As we discussed, it does travel well on the winds and it settles predictably. As you would expect, it's going to settle on horizontal surfaces. It's going to be more impactful on the exterior of the building than the interior if it's coming from a wildfire. So this is the particle counter that Michelle talked about before. This is used to evaluate the particulate level in the air. And it looks at several different sizes, and critically for our purposes, it looks at PM 2.5 and PM 10. You would expect that the indoor levels are going to increase as the outdoor levels increase. There are no definitive standards, but rarely we don't have any baseline information on a particular facility that we can compare the levels to. So for example, we're coming in, we're looking at the particle counts within your building after a wildfire event. We wouldn't necessarily have anything to compare them to from earlier, prior to the wildfire event. And that's important because if we're consistently getting these elevated levels, we would want to be able to say, okay, well, this area just tends to have a higher particulate level, but we can also look at some historical air monitoring data to try and look at that. But generally what we're trying to determine is evaluating how well the building has been cleaned and if it is still being impacted by higher particulate levels outdoor. So we're going to be evaluating if there were any HVAC modifications done, if those have been effective, if the building access controls are effective in controlling the particulate level, and if any of the cleaning or utilization of those air handling units, the HEPA scrubbers, have been useful. This is our super high-tech surface dust sampler. This is a tape lift is what we use to collect particulate matter, smoke-related particulate, and that's defined as char, ash, and soot. It's nothing fancier than a glass microscope slide and a piece of Scotch tape. We'll place the tape down, sticky side down, onto the suspect area, and then put that sticky tape down onto the microscope slide, and that goes to the lab. And the analyst will put that under a microscope and try and identify what the nature of all those different particulates are. When we conduct surface dust sampling, we're looking to find it. So we're going to take a sample where we see any unusual amount of accumulation, any particular areas of concern. So if there's, been a complaint of, odors or respiratory issues in a certain area, we'll sample within there. And generally, we want to look at representative areas. We're looking at doorway thresholds, any surfaces adjacent to exterior entry points, and then representative interior surfaces as well. Oh, that was my last slide. So we'll take some questions now. I think I can hand this back to Taylor, or maybe Michelle can hand it back to Taylor, and we can start fielding some of these questions.
Yeah, thank you, Madeleine and Michelle. That was wonderful. Before we jump into the technical questions that we've received, we've had several questions about whether or not the webinar will be recorded and shared. And the answer is yes. We will be uploading this recording to our YouTube channel later this afternoon, and we'll send that link out to the video later today. And now to the technical questions. Does this apply only to impacts from wildfires, or do other fire types apply as well? This new ruling.
It is with regard to wildfires. So yes, just wildfires, not
Great.
not.
And who is responsible for enforcing or assuring compliance with this law?
The employer.
And does the training need to be conducted
Taylor,
when the
I'm
fire
sorry.
is active? Oh, go ahead.
Can I back up 1 second? Michelle, I wonder if they meant that is Cal OSHA going to conduct inspections and make sure that this is being enforced during events?
Got it. Sorry. Okay. Well, I'll add some more then. So this emergency regulation, it started in July and it will be ending actually in January 2020. Well, they may extend it 90 days, or they may decide whether or not to make it permanent and make some changes to it. But I would hope that they're enforcing it, and if so, it would be some of their inspectors. I've actually had some correspondences with people from Cal OSHA, and they've asked me if I've been contacted by clients or had anybody talking about this regulation. So they're aware of it. Whether or not they are going out there and fining people, I am not aware of that at this time. But regardless, the employer should be responsible to put this into place immediately.
Great. And does the training need to be conducted when the fire is active, or can it be an annual training?
I would recommend an annual training. I think that's great. And I also think when a wildfire occurs, maybe a refresher, or if you think similar to maybe construction, the tailgate talk before a meeting, and you kind of say, hey, we're going out to do work today. We are listing all the hazards that are potentially going to happen, or the potential hazards associated with our work that's going on today, and wildfires should be one of them if a wildfire is in the area and suspected to reduce air quality. So I would recommend an annual training as part of your general IIPP and your health and safety program, but also when actual events occur, or maybe even beginning of the fire season, which is now a very vague time of the year. It used to be maybe 3 or 4 months, and now I pretty much call it 6, 7 months of the year. But I would recommend that.
Great. And do you know of any general trainings or training outlines available via Cal OSHA or other avenues?
The Cal OSHA, if you look at the regulation, they have an Appendix B that talks about the mandatory information that needs to be provided to employees about wildfire safety. So it's not an outline, but it does provide information that needs to be included. So I would start with that. That's all I think is currently available, and it kind of goes over the N95 and respiratory protection requirements as well. So it gives a good amount of information to begin with, and then again, couple it with the work practices that you have going on at your company or work specific items that need to also be included.
Great. And is a written plan a requirement of the regulation?
The plan that Madeleine went over is not. The regulation does not talk about a specific plan either. It just talks about what you need to do. However, if you feel that this is going to be an issue with your employees, I would definitely recommend it being a part of your health and safety program. So everything is written and in place and implemented.
Great. And what kind of PM sensors are being recommended for monitoring? Are there any plans to do proper operation verification like a QA/QC protocol?
The standard also goes into specifics about the type of direct reading instrument that needs to be used. During this webinar, we went over 2 different types of monitors, so it's important to know that what you need to look for is one that reads mass concentration, so that will give you a value, a concentration over a volume of air. So if you saw in one of my tables, we were looking at micrograms per cubic meter. That's the type of monitor you need. Madeleine went over something called a particle counter, and that cannot be used for evaluating the worker health and safety of the regulation. That's typically used for a screening of air quality for a post-assessment. And that reads the number of particles per volume. So it's important to know the difference before going into it. And so again, I highly recommend everyone go to the regulation and read about the different types of the type of monitor that you need to have. Some of the ones that I've kind of used and talked about are the TSI. I don't recommend, again, I don't want to, I want to say what's available, but you can use your best judgment in the monitors you use. But something like the TSI dust track works really well. The PDX 1000 from Thermo Scientific, those type of monitors, they need to be able to measure per the standard aerodynamic diameter of 0.1 micrometers up to 2.5. So again, go to the regulation in Appendix A. It provides all that information, and you need to make sure that it's calibrated and maintained and used in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions, similar to any other equipment that you would use in a exposure evaluation.
Great, and this is a little bit of a longer one. I read guidance that suggested shutting off outdoor air intake is not recommended. The minimum % of outdoor air should be maintained as designed for the building/HVAC system. Shutting down outdoor air could affect other building systems, creating a negative pressure and allowing unfiltered air to enter. This was a 2016 Cal OSHA guidance. Is there more current information on this suggesting the contrary?
This is Michelle. Madeleine, you can add too if you'd like. So again, this is why everything needs to be discussed before the fire occurs, and why we highly recommend having this preparedness document created. So the preparing of this. So for certain companies and facilities, yeah, that may be what is necessary. And in some locations, closing the outdoor air might not cause any issues and would provide the best protection for the individuals. So this needs to be discussed. So yes, the 2016 documents did talk about that, reducing it. But again, if your system will not change anything else pressure-wise, maybe a healthcare facility may have that issue because you don't want to change pressurization and from one room to another. However, maybe a classroom that doesn't have any issue with pressurization, necessarily closing the outdoor air intakes may be better than allowing a little bit of outdoor air to come in. So there's so many different circumstances, how close you are to the fire, so many other things that need to be thought of and addressed prior to implementing any of this. So So there's a lot of vagueness in that portion of what to do with the HVAC system, but as a company and as a employer, you need to evaluate this and prepare for what may occur during a wildfire event. And Madeleine, do you have anything you would like to add?
No, I appreciate that question. I think we should probably include that reference if we're going to do this again, because you're looking at sort of this hierarchy of risk, and would it be more detrimental to the occupants of the building to not have a functioning HVAC system in the future? Then that has to be factored into it too. So there's a lot of different layers, and I absolutely agree. This is why having all of these conversations with your facility staff is really critical. I've seen situations where people start to develop this plan and they leave engineering or EVS out of the conversation because they're really just focusing on, maybe some human resources issues or, health effects, and they're not necessarily thinking about how the building actually functions. So having those building experts is really, really critical.
Thank you. So next question is, particulate counters usually do not have any way to convert mass concentration for AQI conversion. How is this done with this counter?
Yeah, I answered that in the last question, but yeah, so the particle counter, when we were talking about it in terms of the post-assessment, was not to evaluate worker protection or to comply with the regulations. That was a general screening to look at the level of cleanliness and reduction of particulates in the air for a post-cleaning. So if we're talking about the regulations specifically, we need the mass concentration particulate monitor, not the particle counter.
Great. Next question. If there is, say, a fire in Malibu, is monitoring done via smoke trail?
I don't know what that means. I apologize. If they're talking about the last fire, smoke trail, during wildfire events, well, sorry, let me back up. AQMD has a certain amount of monitors out there, regardless of fire events, and they typically put them in areas where they know there's potential reduction of air quality because of industrial processes. So obviously that's why there are no monitors in Malibu, because they don't have any industrial processes over there. During wildfire events, other air management districts, such as CARB, the Air Resource Board for California, may put out additional monitors to continually evaluate because they know of this issue. I don't believe there were any out in Malibu, but in terms of identifying what AQI values are for areas that aren't being monitored, I don't know what a smoke trail is, but they do forecasting, wind direction, and they have got a lot of different parameters, the terrain, to calculate this AQI value. And it may be on the website exactly how they calculate it. I've seen a little portion of it, but I'm sure there's a lot more in detail that's not provided. But yeah, they don't always necessarily have monitors everywhere. That's an important thing to know. However, they do add more during wildfire events, but not necessarily enough to reflect your specific work area.
Great. Next question is, how soon do we need to change N95 masks when PM 2.5 is 151 or greater?
For disposable, the regulations actually does not talk about that, but when you're using a disposable face mask, typically I dispose of them when I'm done using them. So not wearing them more than one day is what I typically recommend. And if there is a need to dispose of them more often, just because they're no longer fitting to the face correctly because of continual use or the amount of movement you're doing, you may need to replace them more often. So, and actually I'm looking just at sorry, one more thing, sorry. If you look at just N95s in general, and when they talk about replacement, they generally say replace if damaged, deformed, dirty, or difficult to breathe in.
Great. And the next question is, how does a vegetation fire become a wildfire? Excuse me, when does a vegetation fire become a wildfire?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but they have specific, I think you may be able to look at the U.S. Forest website. I know that we had what I called a wildfire, the Getty Fire, here in Southern California recently, and it burned a lot. It burned a good amount of structures and a lot of vegetation. However, I believe it still has not been classified as an actual wildfire. So I do not know the complete answer of that, but there are specific criteria that it needs to meet in order to be designated as a wildfire.
Great, and just a few more questions here. How involved is the state of California with wildfire smoke preparedness?
Madeleine, do you want to answer that with the website you recently read about?
The Firewiseorg website?
Correct.
So that's a national website. But the, I mean, I would think the proactiveness of creating this regulation sort of shows that they are they're at least concerned, you know, they've seen enough. I think that where I've seen them more present during wildfire events is outdoor construction sites, because it's, you know, you're sort of in a fishbowl and we have a lot of construction going on right now. As far as their level of involvement in developing worker protections, I can't say specifically. That website, though, is a tremendous resource, and the presentation that we saw was given by a former California fire chief who's now working at the Stanford campus, and you know, is very involved in the process of evaluating these spaces and works with fire departments throughout the state to help them reach out to the public and get this information out there.
Great. Will you restate that website one more time, Madeleine?
It's firewise.org. And it's the
Great.
NFPA, it's the National Fire Protection Association.
Wonderful. Two more questions here. Does this regulation apply only during wildfire events, or at any time PM 2.5 is too high for any reason?
It's only during wildfire events.
Great. And last question, I'm going to try and work my way through this one. Where can we find the conversion calculation from UG/M3 to AQI index?
They have it available on the majority of the air quality management websites, where they even have, you can put your value in there and it will convert it. So just refer to whatever air quality management district you generally rely on.
Great. Well, that concludes our presentation. Thank you, Madeleine and Michelle. That was great. Again, we will be sharing a link to this recording later this afternoon. If you have any questions whatsoever, we will also shoot an email out to you with Madeleine and Michelle's contact information, so you can reach out to them directly. Thank you all for joining us, and we will talk to you soon.